Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're with us. I'm Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and MSNBC, and I am thrilled to have a superb journalist with us today, Kara Lenig, a three-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and her new book, Zero Fail, on the Secret Service, the U.S. Secret Service, taking an extraordinary deep dive into the history of the Secret Service, the evolution of it, and bringing it up to today to the most compelling information about her research into what we see now with the Secret Service, especially under Donald Trump, most controversially. So it's an absolutely up-to-date book. Carol, congratulations. Thanks so much for being with us. And tell us, first of all, the depth of your research and why you tackled this subject.
Andrea, superb journalist. I'm with one, and it's you, and I'm so glad you're here. And I know that you're going to ask me some good and some hard questions, which I'm excited about too. I fell into this beat, as you know, because you're the doyen of Washington reporting. I felt nobody covers the Secret Service as a beat. I fell into it by accident in Washington because there was this terrible scandal in 2012 where a group of agents were sort of unceremoniously shipped back from President Obama's trip there because they had been treating the trip as sort of a boys gone wild weekend, a bachelor's kind of weekend, prostitutes, heavy drinking, and they were found out. They were caught. That's what I thought was the most humiliating thing that could ever happen to the Secret Service. But in reality, I met many, many, many more agents as I tried to understand what happened. And that led me to something more frightening, more horrifying. And that was that many of these agents, not just the ones who got in trouble, but many others were far more worried about the president being killed on their watch, far more worried about the chinks in the armor of the Secret Service. Over time, I became so fascinated by this elite agency that I ended up interviewing 180 different people, directors, former agents, current agents, officers, family members, top cabinet members who oversaw the agency over time, just trying to understand what had happened to this, again, incredibly noble law enforcement agency that we all think of as kind of perfect until this happened.
Where did things go off the tracks? Let's go back. I mean, you trace it in history. There was the assassination of President McKinley. Of course, many of us of a certain age will never forget what happened in 1963 with JFK. So after the Kennedy assassination, there was a real reboot and a much more professionalized demand on the agency, correct?
That's absolutely right. Reboot's a great word for it. A complete rebuilding of the agency after the death of President Kennedy. You know, having an American president gunned down in an American city was a trauma, right, to everyone in America at the time. But it was a gut punch like you can't imagine for the Secret Service. A hair shirt that they wore for decades because they viewed it as their fault. Partially it was, partially it wasn't. They weren't prepared for what happened that day, and they should have been. But they devoted themselves to rebuilding that agency, and they succeeded and were vindicated. When President Ford's life was almost taken, choice, people tried to kill him in the streets. When President Reagan almost lost his life, came very close to losing it in 1980, just months into his presidency. And so all of that training and rigorous rebuilding that the agency did really worked. And after 9/11, a few things started to slide, and it became a steady, gradual downward trajectory where the service just, its mission kept going up and its resources kept going down. And its culture started to corrupt and warp and bend, become more insular and arrogant, covering up problems instead of trying to fix them. And
Now,
that's where we found ourselves, sorry, in 2012 going forward.
so looking at that, it would seem to be that as a result of the 9/11 Commission, really, and some of those, reforms, the Secret Service was taken from the Treasury Department and put in this new creation of the Department of Homeland Security, with a lot of other things like the Director of National Intelligence. A lot of agencies were put together, grouped together. It took a while, I know, with the intelligence agencies that I cover very intensively, to sort out the wrinkles, if you will, to iron it all out and get it working more smoothly. Is that what happened to the Secret Service when this elite group was taken from the Treasury and put, and arguably it was a good decision. They involve Homeland Security more than the Treasury, where they started, they started out as an agency looking at counterfeit money, in the 1800s, I guess.
Yes.
So is that where maybe something fell through the cracks? Maybe their budget.
Yeah, I think your analogy is perfect, actually. The combo of all the intelligence agencies, and then again the combo of all these Homeland Security agencies that ostensibly are supposed to protect the homeland from terror and other dangers. There were a lot of wrinkles to sort of iron out. I think it was one of the key factors. It wasn't the only one in the Secret Service's slow, gradual slide and ultimately demise almost. After 9/11, billions of dollars are going to be poured and are poured into the huge sub-agencies of the Department of Homeland Security that are fighting terror in the skies, making sure we can all fly, safely, and that our planes aren't going to be turned into rocket-propelled missiles to attack our country again. There are billions poured into protecting the perimeter of the country, keeping truck bombs out and fertilizer that is used for explosives, keeping terror cells out at our ports and various other places. Billions of dollars and incredible technology. But this tiny little agency, relatively a dwarf compared to those, the Secret Service is sort of shoved into this agency and essentially becomes shortchanged over and over again in the budget fight, proportionally getting less, not just less money, proportionally getting less and less, while again, its mission is rising. We all think of the Secret Service as this agency whose primary role is keep the president alive, right? He's awake in the morning, make sure he gets into bed, alive. And they have so much more that they have to do. 42 people were protected during President Trump's presidency, presidential grandchildren, now vice presidential stepchildren, multiple cabinet secretaries. A Treasury secretary, just for legacy reasons, Secretary Mnuchin, kept getting security protection, though there was no threat assessment ever done to determine that anyone was trying to hurt him. That's a lot of money. On top of that, after 9/11, the Secret Service is responsible for protecting events where Americans gather that could be the target of terror, Super Bowls, Olympics. They're also responsible for their legacy investigations involving counterfeiting, financial crimes, also cyber hacking. There's just almost too much for them to do while their dollar investment from the federal government is falling precipitously.
Let me pick up on the Mnuchin example. We happen to know that Secretary Mnuchin was in the Persian Gulf around the time of the January 6th episode. Well, he must have had a full detail there. That kind of travel is hugely expensive. And it's been alleged that he was there on developing his personal hedge fund. There was no real foreign policy reason for the Treasury Secretary that close to the end of their term to be over there, as was Jared Kushner at the same time. So there are a lot, when you talk about the children, these are adult children with huge expenses and business all over the world traveling. Also, during our primaries, even before they become the nominee of the two parties, as threat levels increase, you had multiple candidates in the Democratic Party, the last round in 2016, multiple candidates back, before that in the Republican Party. So there is, when you have 17 to 20 candidates, at least a couple of them are going to be given Secret Service protection, which is signed off by the president based on a threat assessment. That said, bringing it up to date before we go back and speak about specific incidents. What is your evidence of politicization that, in fact, some of the current agents were on social media identifying with former President Trump, with the January 6th events, being more political than we have any reason to expect or deserve the Secret Service to be? And I should point out, the agency has pushed back hard against this, saying that their problems were in the past, that their problems were budget related, that since an Inspector General report that they have really reformed in recent years.
So I'm glad you bring up the issue of both the politicization and also the Secret Service's pushback. We should definitely talk about both. On the politicization, this is an agency, as a scene setter, that is supposed to be above and beyond politics. There's a wonderful saying in the agency: the people elect them, we just protect them. The Secret Service is not rooting in its heart for any particular party, any particular man. Eventually, we'll see woman. They're trying to protect the office because that protects the democracy. It creates a smooth running government. Kennedy's assassination was not just traumatic, it also had national security implications. And Reagan's near death also had national security implications. People were worried about whether or not, Russia was coming for us when he was shot. So that's the goal. However, in recent years, it's become more political. And under President Trump, a couple of lines were crossed that traumatized alumni of the agency and current agents. They were traumatized because, and I don't think that's too strong a word, because they view the agency as pure, non-political. And in this administration we've just experienced, a very, very senior leader of the Secret Service, the head of the president's detail, was so liked by President Trump that he asked and received permission to have this detail leader become his White House Deputy Chief of Staff. That means you're crossing over from a public service role into a political role where you're helping the president basically burnish his image for re-election, stage his campaign rallies, present himself as the best possible candidate. And the director of the Secret Service endorsed and allowed that. So that troubled a lot of alumni who said they would never do such a thing. In addition to that, Secret Service sources of mine sent me screenshots in real time, because they were troubled by this, of social media posting that members of the Secret Service had posted on their own personal Facebook and Twitter sites, where they took political positions. And these political positions were pretty strident, because they were empathizing with and basically encouraging the January 6th attack on the Capitol. In one post, a Secret Service officer who's the supervisor said that the rioters were patriots who were protecting America from, communist sympathizers and liberals. In another series of posts, members of the Presidential Protection Detail were expressing their concern that Donald Trump's rightful second term had been denied him, and that Biden was not a legitimate president, that there had been a coup by the Democrats. It's a big problem if the Secret Service, the entity that's responsible for protecting democracy, doesn't think the current president is legitimately elected.
Do you think that the members of the details should be subject to scrutiny and scrubbing on their social media posts going forward by the agency?
I think the agency should develop a policy that they actually enforce, in which they check for this kind of partisan behavior both ways. If someone were to espouse that President Biden was a wonderful president and should win over any Republicans, that should also be disconcerting.
So let's talk about the incoming president at the time, Joe Biden, his concerns about loyalty and fealty from the outgoing Trump team, or from the current, let's say, the transitional detail.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question, Andrea.
Sorry. What were Joe Biden's concerns as he came into the White House after this controversial election, where for the first time in American history, the outgoing president had refused to concede and still is, as of this date, refusing to concede? You know,
There were three major,
and all that.
yeah.
So what were Joe Biden's concerns from your reporting?
Yeah, from my reporting, there were three major concerns. One was that the then President Trump, was through his, power of personality and insistence, blocking the transition. So, a normal transition is the presumed president-elect gets access to the ongoing government to get prepared. And in this case, there was a lot to prepare for. Coronavirus pandemic was still raging across America, still killing Americans. There was a national security firmament to become briefed in. But President Trump was sort of blocking that. And one key element of blocking that was the Secret Service did not provide the full president-elect detail that they would normally provide a president-elect. Now, President-elect Biden was presumed to be the next president, but he wasn't getting that full protection, an armored car, 24/7 counter assault team. And he did have a new target on his back. November 7th, when he was declared by all of the networks and had won the election in Pennsylvania, the one really big swing state that was still outstanding, he became a person that assassins would want to get. So having that full detail was important. The other thing was, as you know, Joe Biden has friends in the Secret Service because he used to be protected as a vice president. So those friends of his, people that he knows professionally, were warning his transition advisors about this political allegiance that the presidential detail had to President Trump. It's one thing to be supportive of a person. It's another thing to be supportive of a presidency and a president holding power. And that's what worried the transition team. And they were trying to figure out, could they get that entire presidential protection team switched out? In the end, the Secret Service offered a compromise, which was to install supervisors over that presidential detail for Biden that would be people he knew well, people he was familiar with, people he trusted, people who had protected both him and also Jill Biden when she was the second lady.
Let me ask you about the threat levels, because you write, sort of shockingly for those of us who don't remember it as well, but the anti-Catholic threat level when JFK was elected and how that increased. Talk about when President Obama was elected and as a candidate. We've known from reporting about Michelle Obama's fears for her husband, young children moving into the White House after a campaign that was very difficult emotionally, for Michelle.
Yes.
But the first Black president and the increased threat levels, and what we know is that at least twice that we know of, intruders got into the fence, got beyond the fencing, which has now been, as the service notes, made, much taller, and got to the White House, got inside the White House once when the children were there, not the president.
Yes. Well, the précis to this, Andrea, I'm glad you mentioned it, is the threat level. So before President Obama was inaugurated, in the months before, but after his election, the threat levels were spiking to the degree that the agents who were keeping track said it was 4 times the threat level against any other president or any other president-elect. It was because he was a Black president, the first Black president to come to office. And a lot of nationalist and white supremacist groups had intense chatter about the violent ways that Barack Obama was going to meet his end and how they were going to be involved in assassinating him, hanging him, lynching him, killing him, one way or another. Pretty violent, scary stuff. And really exactly what Michelle Obama had feared when she tried to discourage her husband from considering this candidacy. And in 2 terms, many, many things happened and went wrong during President Obama's tenure. In 2011, a man who had been stoked by Alex Jones' radio program and conspiracy theories, had decided that President Obama was the Antichrist, a satanic figure, and that this man, had to take him out, kill him. So he drove hundreds of miles across the country from the West and brought a assault rifle, and from Constitution Avenue started shooting and shot the mansion 7 times, striking it 7 times. It happened that President Obama and his wife were in California at the time and on their way to Hawaii, but their youngest daughter was at home with Michelle Obama's mother, the children's grandmother. And Malia, their older daughter, was on her way home from a school sort of party. So the shooting was quite frightening, apparently, but not until they found out about it later, because the Secret Service didn't realize that the house had been shot until 4 days later, when White House cleaning staff found broken shards on the Truman balcony and alerted the First Lady. Then in 2014, very quickly, a jumper in 29 seconds makes it from a public sidewalk to inside the mansion, walks and runs right through the door, a complex that's basically protected by 150 Secret Service officers and agents and technicians, and got deep into the East Room. You've been there. It's not easy to get in there, but this person did, and it caused the Secret Service to really realize that it wasn't just a weakened armor or a one-off problem. It was a systemic problem. The Secret Service had a chronic weakness and a series of vulnerabilities that had to be addressed.
It's almost like the lack of imagination that brought us 9/11 and the other analogy. But after 9/11, tell me what happened when the president's in Florida. They put him in the air as quickly as possible, not knowing what the other threats are or how many planes are out there. Who is this? They figured out pretty quickly that it was likely Osama bin Laden's group, which I reported at 9:30, half hour later. At that morning, it's very clear who could have done this. But for the instant moments, they took Dick Cheney down to the bunker. What happened when they got to the bunker?
Well, unfortunately, again, you said it beautifully, failure of imagination. The Secret Service hadn't planned for a vice president to need to be spirited to a bunker when the president wasn't at home, which is sort of strange, but they hadn't imagined that. The president was in Florida when the country was attacked. The vice president was in the White House, not in the executive building, but in the White House, in his office there. And there was a delay in the Secret Service receiving the warning that 2 planes were incoming to Washington, and they were 20 minutes out, heading towards the city, and not communicating with any towers. The presumption had to be that they were hijacked and that they were also going to be used as missiles, possibly to get the Capitol, possibly to take out the White House. They just didn't know. Anyway, that delay meant that when they finally realized those planes were coming, the Secret Service agents were clambering to get Cheney down to the bunker. And when they arrived in the down tunnels underneath the East Wing, they realized, of course, that they don't have the special keys because they're vice presidential detail agents. They haven't been briefed on everything about this classified bunker program, and they cannot get him immediately into the Presidential Emergency Operations Command Center. It's really scary because I know it just sounds like a bunker, but that is the nerve center for the government if our country's under attack. And at that moment, the president wasn't available. The vice president would have been the president if something had happened.
The book is just filled with these kinds of examples of extraordinary, misses and near misses. Is the agency taking it seriously?
So far, the Secret Service has essentially followed its pretty normal playbook, which is nothing to see here. All of our problems have been fixed. They ever described my book as a rehash of old things that have happened. Some of the things I'm describing happened in the last several months. And the Secret Service is full of incredible, dedicated agents and officers and leaders, incredible people who give and sacrifice things I could not do. I'm amazed and in awe of them. However, as an agency, one of their weaknesses is their inability to accept that they have a weakness. And I hope that they will listen to my book, because essentially it is just agents and officers risking a lot to sound this alarm bell. They're worried about chinks in the armor. They're worried there's not enough money. They are worried they don't have the tools and the technology they need for this ridiculously large mission. And they're worried about their leadership basically putting their head in the sand and not being willing to take on this huge challenge of, again, rebuilding and reinvigorating the agency, which is what is needed now.
You know, I was thinking of a fictional treatment of this, the movie In the Line of Fire, about an agent haunted by having failed at the JFK assassination, who then miraculously, manages to have the credibility to get back in the line of fire and save the current president from a disaster at a political rally, a political fundraiser. So that's a great movie, beautifully directed and acted. But it is true that the agent in charge of JFK's assassination, of the detail, was haunted for the rest of his life by that failure. And then
Yes.
at the same time, you have the heroism of the agents involved in the Reagan attempted assassination. If you could talk about, Tim, the individual in that scenario in 1981, of course, that horrible March day.
There are so many amazing heroes in that moment. Of course, the Secret Service did some things wrong that day. They allowed John Hinckley to get so close outside the Hilton where the president was walking that he was literally 11 feet away and could shoot 6 times in 1.6 seconds because that area hadn't been screened. There were so many things they did right that day. And again, vindicating their training, vindicating the rebuild of the agency that happened in 1964 going forward by Director Jim Rowley, who ironically is the grandfather-in-law of Tony Blinken, if you can believe that. Washington is such a small world. The heroism of that day, you think about the men who are around Reagan when he is shot by Hinckley. The first sound of a gunshot, the first crack, no one is looking over their shoulder as they did the day in Dealey Plaza in Dallas. No agents are trying to figure out what's going on. They hear the crack, you see the film a million times, they immediately act. Tim McCarthy, who is in front of the president, puffs out his chest like a lizard, like an iguana, throws up his arms and takes the incoming bullets and spins around. The bullet literally spins his body around and he falls on the ground. Behind him, Jerry Parr, the detail leader, shoves Reagan as fast as he can, one arm on his shoulder, another arm on his basically belt loop, and pushes him into the floor of the backseat of the limo so hard that Ronald Reagan thinks that Jerry Parr has cracked his rib. It actually hits his jaw on the way in. There's no second guessing. It's instantaneous. And they saved his life. Now, a bullet did ricochet inside the essentially the well of the opening of the door of the limousine and did nick in the backside Reagan's lung. But that day, Jerry Parr in the back of the limo, as they're speeding towards what they call Crown, the White House, he sees the president sort of spitting up sort of pinkish froth out of his mouth that looks bloodied. And he knows something's wrong, but he can't find any blood on the president's shirt, nothing. Can't find blood, can't find a gunshot wound, but he just decides to reroute the limo to the hospital. And if he had not done it, Reagan would be dead.
It was, I was covering that day, and we didn't know at the time they covered it up, to speak of coverage, but we now, of course, know Jerry Parr's reactions were heroic. It was training, it was instinct, and President Reagan almost died. He came within a millimeter of that bullet hitting his heart, as well as the fact that he needed surgery so quickly. Carol, this has just been extraordinary. It's such a treat to have a longer chance. I've interviewed you on my program, but not at this wonderful length. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to add?
I think the thing that I would say is that I've become really impressed by so many people in this agency. And some of them lost their jobs talking to me because it is a fireable offense to talk to a reporter without permission. The risks that they took tell me how dedicated they are and how worried they are about the Secret Service. If they were willing to take these steps, then I think America, the president, and Congress should be listening to them and listening to their alarm, which is, don't wait for another JFK moment. Don't wait for catastrophe and react to it after the fact. Please do something now. That is what they have said. And I'm just, literally a vessel for that concern.
I did want to bring up what happened when President Trump got COVID and went to Walter Reed. And then we saw the agents, when he decided to go out of the hospital after he'd gotten an infusion, I guess, felt better, and he went out, and they had to drive him around so he could basically do something that I have to say was political, was to rally the people who were shouting in favor of him outside. Within 24 hours, I think, of when he had been hospitalized. How did those agents feel? And how did the agents feel who were at some of those other events, like the Tulsa rally, and were exposed to COVID just because of detail?
This is an interesting element to your earlier question about politicization. The agency was really divided about those steps. Many people on the presidential protection detail who are responsible for being, at the president's shoulder, were completely fine with the president's choices and completely accepting and encouraging of the president's choices to deploy them as a political tool. They were sent out into the public while COVID was raging with no choice about whether or not they were going to be thrown into a pandemic with the public, indoor rooms, planning these events. No choice. Detail leaders were fine with that risk. And in fact, in Bedminster, when the president was traveling there on his way to another rally in the summer, presidential detail agents were telling agents and officers with masks on to take them off because quote unquote, the president doesn't like to see it. Pretty disturbing to one part of the Secret Service who believes really strongly that masks are a good idea and prevent the spread and the transmission and the infection rates. And they were really tragically worried about infecting their families when they went home. Mm-hmm. Again, the presidential detail leaders and agents were totally fine with not wearing masks and discouraging others from wearing them. Then when the president gets COVID, you could argue that that's a Secret Service failure as well. You don't really want the president to come in contact with a lethal virus that could lead to a lethal disease, but that's what happened. When the president gets COVID and wants to, within roughly 36 hours of his diagnosis, go out and rally the faithful waiting outside for him and project strength and that he's hale and hearty and making a quick recovery. When he wants to go out and show himself to them in a little SUV joyride, the agents with him are totally on board, totally fine with that. But many other agents who are not immediately on the president's shoulder are infuriated because it signals that the president doesn't really care about the agent's health. It signals that the political message that he wants to get across is far more important than these public servants and their family's health.
Well, we've only just begun to dig through the incredible detail, the extraordinary reporting. Hats off to you, Carol Leonnig. You are really a national treasure in your ability to synthesize, to report, to get people to talk to you. I know how hard that is, and to synthesize it into a compelling narrative. The book is Zero Fail, and I could not be more excited about the acclaim it's already achieved, and I know is going to continue to achieve. So I've got it here. I travel with it. I learn so much every day from this book, and I know all of you will as well. Thank you, Carol Leonnig. Thanks for taking time to be with us today. And thanks
Andrea,
to Chicago Humanities Group for our hosts.
thank you to our hosts, but thank you, Andrea, too. And you've been a role model, really. So it's kind of amazing to be interviewed by you now. Thank you so much for this event. And that's all I could say. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you and for joining us today, this has just been a fascinating talk for me. I learned something every time I'm with Carol. So thanks to all of you and good day.